Hi guys, hope you're all okay. Back with the next part of the BFG. We're getting very close to the end now because the Queen has sent the army and the Air Force off with the BFG to go and find and capture those 9 horrible human being eating giants. So let's find out how they do that. And I can see helicopters. The BFG made thousands of journeys to and from Giant Country in his life over the years, but he had never in his life made one quite like this one, with 9 huge helicopters roaring around alongside just by his head. He'd never before travelled in broad daylight either. He hadn't dared to do that, but this was different. Now he was doing it for the Queen of England, and he was frightened of nobody. As he galloped across the British Isles with the helicopters thundering above him, people stood and gaped and wondered what on earth was going on. They'd never seen the likes of this before, and they never would again. Every now and then, the pilots of the helicopters would catch a glimpse of a small girl wearing glasses crouching inside the giant's ear, waving to them. They always waved back to her, and the pilots marvelled at the giant's speed and the way he leapt across rivers and huge houses. But they hadn't seen anything yet. "Be careful, hold on tight," the BFG said. "We's going as fast as a fizzlecrump." And the BFG changed into his famous top gear. And all at once he began to fly forward as though there were springs in his legs and rockets in his toes. He went skimming over the earth like some magical hop, skip and jumper, and his feet hardly ever even touching the ground. And as usual, Sophie had to crouch down low in the crevice of his ear to save herself from being swept clean away. The 9 pilots in their helicopters suddenly realised that they were starting to be left behind. The giant was streaking ahead, and they opened up their throttles to full speed, and even then they were only just able to keep up with him. In the leading machine, the head of the Air Force was sitting there besides the pilot. He had a world atlas, a map, on his knees, and he kept staring at the atlas and then at the ground below, trying to figure out exactly where they were going. Frantically, he turned the pages of the map book. "Where the devil are we going?" he cried. "I haven't the foggiest idea," the pilot answered. "Queen's orders were just to follow that giant, and that is exactly what I'm doing." And the pilot was a young Air Force officer with a bushy moustache. He was very proud of his moustache. He was also quite fearless, and he loved an adventure. He thought this was a super adventure. "It's fun going to new places," he cried. "New places?" shouted the head of the Air Force. "What the blazes do you mean, new places?" "The place we're flying over now. That's not on the atlas, is it?" the pilot said, grinning. And there's a picture of them, look, in the helicopter, flying to Giant Country. "You're not right, it isn't on the map," cried the head of the Air Force. "We've flown right off the page." "I expect the old giant knows what he's doing," the young pilot said. "He's leading us into a disaster," cried the head of the Air Force. He was shaking with fear. And in the seat beside him sat the head of the army, who was even more terrified. "You don't mean to tell me we've gone right out of the atlas?" he cried, leaning forward to have a look at the map. "That's exactly what I'm telling you," cried the Air Force man. "Look for yourself. He's the very last map in the whole flaming atlas, and we've gone off it over an hour ago." He turned over the page. In all atlases, there were 2 completely blank pages at the very end of the book. "Now we must be somewhere around here, I suppose," he cried, putting a finger right on a blank page of the book. "Where's here, though?" cried the head of the army, and the young pilot who was flying grinned broadly. "That's why we're always to put 2 blank pages at the back of the atlas, for new countries. You meant to fill them in yourself when you find a new country. The head of the Air Force glanced down at the ground below them. Just look at this God-forsaken desert, he cried. All the trees are dead, all the rocks are blue. The giant, he's stopped, cried the young pilot. He's waving us to come down. And the pilots throttled back the engines and all 9 of the helicopters landed safely down on the great yellow wasteland below. Each of them lowered a ramp down from its belly, and 9 jeeps, big jeeps, one from each helicopter, were driven down the ramps, and each jeep contained 6 soldiers and a vast quantity of very long, thick rope and heavy chains. I don't see any giants round here, cried the head of the army. The giants, they's all just out of sight. They're over there, cried the BFG. If you was taking those slosh-buckling, noisy big helly-boppers all closer into them, then all them giants, they'd be waking up. And all them giants, oh, pop goes the weasel. Ah, so you want us to proceed in the jeeps? Yes, the BFG said, but you must all be very, very hushy quiet. No roaring and motors, no shouting about, no mucking around, no piggery-jokery. And the BFG and Sophie, still in his ear, remember, they trotted forward and the jeeps followed closely behind them, going to find the giants. Suddenly, the most dreadful rumbling noise was heard by everyone. The head of the army went pea green in the face. Oh. Those are guns, he cried. There's a battle raging somewhere. Turn back, the lot of you. Come on, let's get out of here. Pig squiffle, the BFG said. Those noises not guns? Of course those are guns, shouted the head of the Air Force. I'm a military man. I know a gun when I hear one. Turn back, everyone. Those is just the giants snortling away in their sleep, the BFG said. I's a giant myself. I know how a giant snortles when I hear one. Are you quite sure? The army man said anxiously. I's positive, the BFG said. Okay, proceed cautiously, the army man ordered, and they all moved on. And then they saw them. Even at a distance, they were enough to scare the daylights out of the soldiers. But when they got close and saw what the giants really looked like, they began to sweat with fear. 9 fearsome, ugly, half-naked, 50-feet-long brutes lay sprawled out over the ground in various grotesque attitudes of sleep. And the sound of their snoring was indeed like gunfire in a battle. And the BFG raised up a hand, and the jeeps all stopped, and the soldiers got out. What happens if one of them wakes up? Whispered the head of the army, his knees knocking together. If one of them is waking up, he will gobble you down before you can say Jack the knife. The BFG answered, grinning hugely. Me, he's the only one what won't be gobbled up, because giants is never eating other giants. Me and Sophie is the only safe ones, because I is hiding her if that happens. Now the head of the army took several paces to the rear. So did the head of the Air Force. They climbed rather quickly back into their jeep, ready to make a fast getaway if necessary. Okay, go forward, men, go forward, the head of the army said. Go forward and do your duty bravely. And the soldiers crept forward towards the sleeping giants. All of them were trembling mightily, and none of them dared speak a word. The BFG, with Sophie now sitting on the palm of his hand, stood watching this operation. To give the soldiers their due, they were extremely courageous. There were 6 well-trained, efficient men working on each giant, and within 10 minutes, 8 out of those 9 giants had been trussed up, tied like chickens, and they were still snoring contentedly. The ninth giant, who happened to be the Flesh Lump Eater, was causing trouble for the soldiers because he was lying with his right arm tucked right underneath his body. It was impossible to tie his wrists together without first getting that arm out from underneath him. Very, very cautiously, the 6 soldiers who were working on the Flesh Lump Eater began to pull at that huge arm, trying to get it out and release it. The Flesh Lump Eater opened his tiny piggy black eyes. "Which of you foul besters is wiggling on my arm?" he bellowed. "Is it you, man-hugger?" Suddenly he saw the soldiers that were there. In a flash, he was sitting up, looked around him. He saw more soldiers all around. With a roar, he leapt to his feet. The soldiers were petrified with fear. And they froze right where they were. They had no weapons with them. The head of the army put his jeep into reverse. "Human beings!" the Flesh Lump Eater yelled. "What is all you flush-spunking rotsome half-baked beans doing in our giant country?" And he made a grab at a soldier, swept him up his hand. "He's having early supper today," he shouted, holding up the poor squirming soldier at arm's length and roaring with laughter. Sophie, standing there on the palm of the BFG's hand, was watching horror-struck. "Do something! Quick, before he eats him!" "Put that human being down!" the BFG shouted. And the Flesh Lump Eater turned and stared right at the BFG. "What is you doing here with these nasty, grotty twiglets? You is making me very suspicious." The BFG made a rush at the Flesh Lump Eater, but the colossal 54-foot giant simply knocked him over with a flick of his giant arm. At the same time, Sophie fell out of the BFG's hand onto the ground. Her mind was racing. She must do something. Her mind was going crazy. She remembered. She remembered that brooch, the sapphire brooch the Queen had put onto her chest. Quickly, she undid the brooch. And that's where we're going to leave it, because there's lots left. So what is Sophie going to do with the brooch? With a sharp, sparkly brooch. How can she help? Think about that, and we'll find out next time when we finish the story of the BFG. Take care, everyone. See you soon.